Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our last Bible Ponder before Christmas. We're going to wrap up here and talk about Matthew and Luke's genealogies and the differences and discrepancies and why they do or don't matter. If you've been following our series, we've looked at Matthew's genealogy from the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the very opening of the New Testament as we often have it presented. And we looked at that in two parts. And then we looked at Luke's genealogy and looked at how it's different, and then what Luke is doing that's very different than Matthew's. And so tonight I just want to sort of tie them together and talk about the differences and talk about why it doesn't matter to me that they're different. So what is the issue? What is the problem? Part of why I picked to do this is because it's Christmas and because it's the genealogy of Jesus, and they're both part of the story of Jesus in the early days. And so it makes sense to talk about it at Christmas time. But I also picked them because they're an obvious and easy example of differences in the biblical text. So they present a problem, a serious problem that needs to be solved if you are trying to hold on to the idea that the biblical text is absolutely perfect and flawless and without error. Right away, you have this issue where two different Gospels are presenting the genealogy of Jesus, essentially what is just, a factual list of ancestry, but they're wildly different. So if you're beginning with the idea that the biblical text has to be perfect, then you have a problem and you need to solve it. And then you need to go through a lot of mental gymnastics and a lot of clever reasoning in order to kind of reconcile what seems to be a problem with the biblical text. And if you're assuming there can't be a problem, then there has to be a solution. And then you've got to figure out why this is, or your entire reasoning falls apart because, oops, right there, the Bible's not perfect. So it's all meaningless and it all goes out the window. And then you have a problem. If you have to get it all right, if the Bible has to be perfect, then as soon as you find a flaw, it all falls apart. And there have been a lot of Christians who have held on to this, and there's been a lot of people who aren't Christians who have really gone in and attacked this idea. And if you present the Bible as perfect, it's fairly easy to find places where it's not. And then you poke holes, and then you get into these kind of silly fights about something that doesn't even need to be a fight. When you begin by tying yourself to something like biblical inerrancy, which is the term for the belief that the Bible is perfect, or that any flaws or problems are only problems on the surface, and there's some kind of explanation for why they're there. They also lead to other problems as well. So it's a line of thinking that also leads into other traps of interpretation. And these are some of the things that we've talked about in previous Bible Ponder series. Traps such as if you're assuming that the Bible is perfect, it sort of naturally leads you to assume that other characters in the Bible are perfect, and then you end up in traps trying to come up with reasoning or come up with ways to justify things that characters do in the Bible. Especially in the Old Testament, you have a lot of problem trying to justify things that Abraham does or David does or whoever, because they're characters in the Bible, and so everything they do has to somehow be the right thing to have done because the Bible is perfect. And then you have to somehow justify how Judah slept with his daughter-in-law and she got pregnant, and that's part of the genealogy. And we talked about that in the second part of Matthew's genealogy. And then you're having to try and justify other characters in the Bible. So not only does it lead to problems of trying to sort out things like Matthew's genealogy is wildly different than Luke's genealogy. Which one is right? Oh no, Jesus, it's all in flux. It leads to other interpretational problems, and you really just don't need to have those problems. What I would say instead is that the biblical text points us to the truth, points us to this ultimate truth. It points us to God. The biblical text tells the stories of Jesus, who was God, and that for us now, 2,000 years on from Jesus, The biblical text is one of, if not the best way for us to get at who Jesus was and what he did and what he taught. But that doesn't mean it has to be perfect or flawless in order to do so. In fact, I kind of find it a bit comforting that it's not perfect. I'm not perfect, and if I was to record stories, I wouldn't expect them to necessarily be perfect, no matter how much I tried. But just because it's not perfect doesn't mean it's not true. Just because some of the stories in Matthew or Mark or Luke or John differ on details or names or places or whatever, it doesn't change what happened or who Jesus was or who the truth was in Jesus. And also when we read and understand that not every single thing in the Bible has to be perfect, we're also freed to grow, to be challenged and to change as we wrestle with the text and we interrogate it and as we come to grips with it in ourselves. And I think it's a really faithful way to read the text. We're forced to confront problems and develop as we develop as human beings as well. And if we assume from the off that the text is perfect, how could we fully change and grow? We just kind of follow orders without question. And that becomes a bit of a problem. And in fact, Jews have for centuries and even up till now, Jews read the text, read the Bible, read the Hebrew Bible very differently than we approach the Old Testament. They wrestle with it, they think through it, they kind of mull it over in their heads, and they don't have to be bound to this idea that it's perfect. The other problem with thinking that the Bible is perfect and that we should just take it, follow orders, and just do what it says, and that's all fine, I hope is very clear from what we've talked about in previous Bible ponders, where that's just impossible. If you put 10 people in a room and tell them, all right, I want you to plainly and clearly follow the perfect instructions in these passages, you'll probably get at least, 7 different interpretations of what that means, because you can't just read the text and understand it as it is. It's just not the way life works. That's not the way reality works. You can't do that. And so I think that is another problem of kind of this holding on to this idea that the biblical text is inerrant and it can't possibly have problems or issues. That doesn't mean the whole thing is false. That doesn't mean it's a book full of lies. That doesn't mean the stories in it aren't reliable or trustworthy. I think there's a lot of it that's really trustworthy and reliable, and a lot of the stories you can definitely get at the truth of what they are. But they're also written by authors to audiences trying to convey certain amounts of meaning. And so what is the point then between Matthew's genealogy and Luke's genealogy and their differences? Well, I think they're both doing what they can to show, first of all, how Jesus is related to David. But also they're doing it for different audiences and different styles. And if we're actually talking, if you're trying to get at a grain of truth and historicity about the biblical text, I think one of the clearest signs that both of these genealogies have that grain of truth, that Jesus is in the line of King David through his adopted father Joseph, is just a simple fact that Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem to register. And that is pretty firm historical ground. There's no reason to doubt that happened. The census was real, and this was the case. And there's a lot of other evidence that points to Bethlehem being where Jesus was born. So if Joseph is doing that, he is descended from David. So that makes very much just perfect sense. So both genealogies are right in that fact. They just take different routes to get there because they're trying to do different things. So does the differences in genealogies, does it change anything about who Jesus was or what he did? No, absolutely not. So for me, that's not a problem at all. It's not an issue. It doesn't change my faith or how I see Jesus or how I interpret the Bible. It just is what it is. It's two ancient authors doing their best to compile a genealogy that goes back to David and beyond. And that's just the way it is. And there are reasons for that. And a lot of people, a lot smarter than me, have tried to figure out and thought through what those differences could mean and why they're there. But ultimately, Jesus is still Jesus. And that's just the way it is. And that's how I accept it. Doesn't hurt me at all. And I think it's kind of fun to see how those different genealogies pull out different ideas about where Jesus comes from. But that's them tied all together. I hope it's been interesting for you to look at both of the genealogies. I know for me, Matthew's genealogy is kind of the one. It's right there at the beginning, as I said, of the New Testament as we have it presented with Matthew first. So very rarely do we actually, I think, hear or read Luke's genealogies. I wonder if you feel different, if you've heard Luke's genealogy before, or if that's maybe the main one you've heard. I know for me, Matthew's is kind of like the only one I ever really encounter, and almost forget that Luke's got a genealogy of Jesus even in there. So I'd be interested to hear what you have to think about that. We will come back in the new year and have a Zoom discussion to kind of talk through the genealogies, talk through maybe a bit about biblical inerrancy, and talk about differences in the Bible and things like that. On the 6th of January, we'll come back and have a look at that. I think is sort of the plan for that. But we'll give some updates on Facebook and keep you posted with that. But thanks for coming along with our journey through the genealogies. I hope it's given you an interesting build up to Christmas. And I hope that Christmas in just a couple days' time brings you some joy and some comfort in these times. So thanks for joining us for our Bible Ponder. Have a good evening.